Chapter 1. The picnic beneath the yew tree Marley Comb was a village that pretended to sleep even while watching everything. It had only one road leading in and another leading out, both winding and lined with hedgerows so thick that newcomers often missed the turn entirely. It was the sort of place where post was delivered on foot. The vicar still rode a bicycle, and the loudest disruption most weeks was Mrs. Tilbury's cockerel escaping into the grocer's garden. June had arrived, gently, with its honeysuckle-scented breezes and a modest sun that did its best not to startle anyone. The annual churchyard picnic, a tradition older than the gravestones themselves, was underway beneath the towering yew tree that shaded much of St. Agnes Church. Folding chairs and gingham blankets sprawled across the grass, and a table buckled under the weight of home-baked goods and lemon cordials. The air was filled with laughter, humming bees, and the distant clink of porcelain teacups. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly near the edge of the gathering, a position she always favoured. From there, one could see everything without appearing to watch. She wore a modest ivory hat with a faded ribbon, and sipped weak tea with the slow appreciation of someone who understood that people, like tea, revealed their full character only when steeped long enough. It was her second week in Marley Comb. Visiting her cousin Emily Hargrave after a troublesome cough had warranted a change of scenery. The change was mild. Marley Comb was not so different from St. Mary Mead, but Jane Marple had never minded repetition. People were much the same wherever you went. The faces changed, but the behaviour seldom did. Today, the real spectacle was not the picnic or the cakes, but Letitia Blackwood, known respectfully and occasionally resentfully as the widow. Twice widowed, sharply intelligent, and draped in lavender lace, she moved through the picnic like a swan among ducks, her chin tilted just enough to command attention without begging for it, and her gloved hands fluttered at her side like punctuation marks, emphasizing remarks that left most people feeling flattered and slightly exposed. "She knows everything, about everyone," muttered Mrs. Crocombe behind Miss Marple, "even things they don't know themselves." "She's kind enough," said another voice, "but that woman is a walking ledger. She remembers every debt, every confession, and every slight." It was true. Mrs. Blackwood's social power didn't come from charity luncheons or donations to the church roof fund. It came from a quiet, ruthless understanding of village psychology. People told her things, often without realizing they had. Her power was less about threatening and more about knowing, the sort of knowledge that could ruin reputations if ever whispered aloud. At precisely 3:00, the widow stood to give her usual address. A short speech thanking the vicar, complimenting the cucumber sandwiches, and offering a wry joke about the village's lack of eligible men. But the words never came. She froze, mid-step, hand rising as if to steady herself. Then she crumpled, not dramatically, but with the unsettling swiftness of a tree struck by lightning. There was a stunned silence. The birds stopped chirping. A child dropped a half-eaten scone. "Letitia?" Mrs. Featherstone gasped, rushing forward. Two men scrambled to catch her, but she had already fallen. Her head struck the corner of a low stone bench. Miss Marple saw the angle, the unnatural stillness, the way her eyes stared blankly at the summer sky. "Fetch the doctor," someone cried. "I think she's fainted." "No," said Miss Marple, softly, not rising yet. "She hasn't fainted." The crowd thickened in an instant. People leaned in, voices tangled with concern and speculation. Someone offered brandy. Another woman wept. Miss Marple finally stood, walking quietly around the edge of the commotion. She did not touch the body. She never did before it was proper. But her eyes flicked to the bruising already blooming beneath the chin, the peculiar dampness near the mouth, and the faint scent of almonds. Cyanide. She had encountered it before. Once in a garden, once in a teacup. It was not always detected right away. But Jane Marple's nose was better than most laboratories. Dr. Pendlebury arrived within 10 minutes. He was a portly man who still used a leather satchel and frequently muttered to himself. After examining the body, he looked up with a face drained of confidence. "She's dead," he said unnecessarily. "But how?" asked the vicar, pale. Dr. Pendlebury removed his spectacles. "I'll need to perform an examination, but it could be natural causes. A stroke, perhaps." Miss Marple cleared her throat, softly. "Doctor," she said in the gentle, unassuming tone that often preceded something critical, "did you happen to notice the smell?" Smell. She glanced at the crowd. Some were beginning to murmur again. "Perhaps later, then," she said, as if it were nothing. But her meaning had landed. Later that evening, the village was aflame with gossip. The widow Blackwood was dead, and at the church picnic no less. Theories emerged like dandelions. A heart attack, a bee sting, shock from heat. But in quiet corners, the whispers turned darker. "I heard she had a feud with Mr. Hemmings." "Well," she threatened, "to tell secrets about the Baxters. Remember that? Poison, they're saying. Isn't that something out of those murder books?" Miss Marple didn't join the speculation. Instead, she returned to her cousin's drawing room and sat quietly by the window, knitting untouched in her lap. Letitia Blackwood was no innocent, she thought. She knew things. She carried people's sins in her purse. But murder? In Marley Comb? That required either desperation or design. Outside, the summer sky was deepening into lavender. A few birds still called. But something else had settled over the village now. Fear, and Miss Marple, calm, kind, and quietly brilliant, had just begun watching. Chapter 2. Whispers and Tea Leaves. The following morning, Marley Comb awoke in a different skin. Though the sky was unchanged, streaked with thin clouds, the hedges damp with dew, something in the village's rhythm had shifted. It was as if the death of Letitia Blackwood had pressed a thumb on the pulse of the place, and now every beat echoed with unease. The widow, it seemed, had not gone quietly. Word spread in that peculiar way unique to English villages, not shouted from rooftops, but passed through teacups and church pews, woven into conversation like embroidery thread. At Mrs. Goodbody's bakery, customers pretended to browse while speculating on the cause of death. At the post office, two women argued over whether her skin had looked blue or merely bruised. And at the heart of it all, where rumour became something sharper, something that cut, was the tea room. The tea room was not large, nor especially fine, but it was central, and had the best view of the village green. Miss Marple arrived just after 10, wearing a pale grey coat and a modest brooch shaped like a forget-me-not. She took her usual table by the window, set her handbag precisely to her left, and ordered Earl Grey and a scone, if it's not too early for butter. 3 other women were already seated near the counter. Mrs. Beryl Cleary, who ran the dress shop and insisted she had warned people about the widow's ways. Miss Annie Leake, the spinster organist with an unfortunate neck twitch, and Mrs. Dunthorpe, the retired schoolmistress who still corrected everyone's grammar in casual speech. "Just dropped dead, they say," Mrs. Cleary was whispering, loud enough for it to travel 3 tables. "She didn't just drop," Miss Leake said nervously. "Did you see her face? That wasn't natural, and the doctor's not talking." "They never do," said Mrs. Dunthorpe grimly, buttering her toast. "They sit on the facts like hens on eggs, afraid of cracking anything before it hatches." Miss Marple sipped her tea, pretending to read a pamphlet on local garden tours. "What's more," said Beryl Cleary, lowering her voice, "someone said she argued with Mr. Simmons the day before, loudly, said she was going to tell everything. What was she planning to tell?" "Simmons has been touchy about his finances for years," said Dunthorpe. "Remember the allotment scandal?" Miss Leake shivered. "And what about that business with the Norrington boy?" She said she knew what really happened. Said it to his mother's face last week, bold as brass. There was a brief silence. Then Mrs. Cleary said what they were all thinking. If she was murdered, well, anyone might have had reason. That was the moment Miss Marple gently folded her pamphlet and smiled at the room. "Oh, good morning, ladies," she said warmly. "Terrible business about Mrs. Blackwood, isn't it?" The trio nodded in synchronized nervousness. "You were there, weren't you, Miss Marple?" asked Mrs. Dunthorpe. "At the picnic?" "I was." She stirred her tea. "It was rather dreadful. She didn't cry out, you know. Just fell, as if the string had been cut." A hush followed. "And now the police are saying nothing," said Mrs. Cleary, clearly fishing. "Well, they often say very little," Miss Marple replied, "particularly when they're uncertain. I imagine they're waiting on the coroner." "They're saying poison," said Miss Leake, barely breathing the word. "Are they?" Miss Marple said lightly. "Then they must have very good noses." Mrs. Dunthorpe blinked. "Did you smell something?" "Only a trace," said Miss Marple. "Something faintly bitter. Not unpleasant exactly, but quite distinct." Mrs. Cleary leaned forward. "You mean she was poisoned?" "I didn't say that," said Miss Marple. "But then again, I didn't say she wasn't." She took a bite of her scone and let the weight of her words hang. By midday, Marley Comb had transformed into a village of shadows. No one said the word murder above a whisper, but it was there, hanging over hedges, peeking from behind closed curtains. The local constable, Inspector Rayner, had called on several villagers, asking routine questions with a notebook. He never seemed to write much in. He came to the vicarage. He visited the bakery. He stopped by the Blackwood house and stood for a long time outside, gazing at the purple wisteria curling along the windows. Letitia's house was closed now, its windows shuttered, its secrets sealed for the moment. Meanwhile, Miss Marple walked the long way back to Emily Hargrave's cottage, her steps slow, her thoughts sharper than ever. She had lived long enough to know the difference between tragedy and deliberate harm. Letitia Blackwood was not the sort of woman who made accidental enemies. She made purposeful ones. Some she humiliated, others she baited with honeyed words, and a few she held in her grasp by the simple act of remembering what they wanted forgotten. Miss Marple's mind wandered back to the picnic, to who had been near the food, who had spoken to the widow last, who had looked surprised and who had looked expectant. Then she remembered something else. The parasol. It had been embroidered, lilac with pale blue stitching. It had landed softly beside Letitia's body. But something about its position had nagged at Miss Marple. It had fallen too neatly, its handle tucked toward the grass, as though it had been placed after the fact. She made a note of that. At the gate to Emily's cottage, Miss Marple paused. The roses were blooming, a deep red velvet sort that seemed almost too vivid against the pale path. A bee hummed by, and yet the peace felt false. Inside, Cousin Emily was baking. The scent of nutmeg filled the house, and a radio murmured something about a fog rolling in from the coast. Emily looked up. "You're quiet, Jane. Thinking again?" Miss Marple smiled. "Always. Did you know Letitia Blackwood well?" Emily wiped her hands. "Well enough. She came to supper once. Bit nosy, if I'm honest. Told me I had the sort of laugh men don't trust. Whatever that means. She had a way of making you feel judged while complimenting your hat." Miss Marple nodded. "Did she have enemies?" Emily scoffed. "She had friends, dear. That was the real mystery." Miss Marple said nothing, but her mind had already begun assembling the first pieces of a very large and complex puzzle. Not just the widow's death, but her life, and the people orbiting her like moths drawn to both flame and fear. Something about the way she died, quickly, publicly, dramatically, told Miss Marple this had not been a crime of opportunity. It had been planned, and whoever had done it had something to hide. Chapter 3. The Man with Too Much to Say. The funeral was scheduled for Thursday. It should have been a solemn affair, but in Marley Comb, funerals had a way of becoming something else entirely. Especially when the person in the coffin was Letitia Blackwood. Whispers about her death were now woven into every corner of village life, from the hedges to the hymn books. People lowered their voices only out of habit, not out of uncertainty. Everyone had made up their minds. Someone had killed her. The question was who, and more importantly, why? That morning, as the bell above the post office tinkled, Miss Marple stepped inside to collect a letter from her niece. She offered a polite nod to Mr. George Simmons, who was already there, leaning far too casually against the counter, chatting with young Elsie, the postmistress. George Simmons was not quite a gentleman, though he dressed like one. 49, unmarried, and fond of grey herringbone suits with handkerchiefs folded just so. He had once worked in finance in London, a job he frequently referenced but never explained. He now lived alone in a modest house on Larkspur Lane, and his favourite hobby was inserting himself into every conversation that wasn't meant for him. "I dare say they'll want an inquest," he was saying, loud enough to fill the small room. "That's the usual procedure in sudden deaths, especially when poison is suspected, eh?" Elsie looked uncomfortable. I don't know, sir." "Oh, come now, girl," Simmons chuckled. "You were there, weren't you? You saw her go down like a puppet. Hadn't even finished her joke, poor woman. Of course it's poison. Miss Marple folded her hands in front of her, her expression neutral. Good morning, Mr. Simmons. You seem remarkably well informed. He turned, grinning. Ah, Miss Marple, the great detective among us. I'm no such thing, she replied lightly, though I do observe things. And I observed you were one of the last people speaking with Mrs. Blackwood before she collapsed. His smile faltered. Did I? Perhaps. One speaks to so many people at these things. Difficult to keep track. You offered her a scone, I believe. Yes, well, I did offer one to several people, he said, brushing invisible lint off his jacket. Common courtesy. Of course, Miss Marple said, and then she died. He stiffened slightly. Are you accusing me of something, Miss Marple? Not at all, she said sweetly. Just noting the order of events. I'm sure the police have already done the same. As she turned to leave, she saw the briefest flash of something in his eyes. Not fear exactly, but a sharpness. George Simmons was a man who prided himself on control. And right now, he was trying very hard to keep it. Later that day, in the vicarage garden, Miss Marple sat with Reverend Featherstone and his wife under the shade of a plum tree. They were sipping cool lemonade from mismatched glasses. The vicar's black Labrador snored nearby. George Simmons is a thoroughly unpleasant man, Mrs. Featherstone declared, dabbing her neck with a handkerchief. Always hovering about the choir, criticizing flower arrangements, and pretending he knows everyone's business better than they do. He seems unnerved, Miss Marple said. Reverend Featherstone nodded. He and Letitia Blackwood had a complicated history. Oh? Said Miss Marple, feigning polite curiosity. They were close once, said the vicar, hesitating. Some years ago, before her second husband died. There were whispers, you understand. Nothing provable, of course. Letitia had a way of making people feel special, Mrs. Featherstone added, but only until she found something more useful elsewhere. She knew how to flatter a man without meaning it. Miss Marple looked down at her hands, and she kept their secrets. Worse, the vicar said, she collected them. By evening, another thread had unravelled. Emily Hargrave, Miss Marple's cousin, was sorting through her sewing basket when she said, Jane, do you know who I saw yesterday near Letitia's house? Who? Mrs. Dunthorpe, the retired schoolmistress. Odd time to be walking past, and she looked, well, purposeful. Miss Marple frowned. Dunthorpe? She and Letitia hadn't spoken in nearly a year. So I heard, Emily said. Something about an accusation. A theft of all things. A pearl brooch that had gone missing at the Women's Guild tea. Letitia implied Dunthorpe had taken it. She? No one knows, Emily said. But Dunthorpe was humiliated. Miss Marple made a quiet note of that. Enemies often wore the face of old friendships turned sour. That night, Miss Marple sat alone by the window in the guest bedroom. The breeze rattled the lace curtain, and the clock ticked gently behind her. Outside, Marley Comb lay wrapped in stillness, but it was a silence loaded with suspicion. Letitia Blackwood had known something. The question was what, and to whom it mattered enough to kill for. She jotted a list in her notebook. George Simmons, nervous, talkative, possibly had a romantic history, Mrs. Dunthorpe, publicly humiliated, had motive and pride. Reverend Featherstone. Too quiet on certain matters, someone else entirely? Then she circled the last entry, because Marley Comb was the sort of place where appearances lied often, and the truth was usually buried beneath manners, gossip, and fear. Letitia had known everyone's secrets. Now someone had killed her to keep one of them hidden, and Miss Marple intended to find out which one. Chapter 4. Secrets in the vicar's ledger. The church bell rang low that morning, not for prayer, but for propriety. Even grief in Marley Comb had its schedule. The vicar, Reverend James Featherstone, wore his mourning vestments like a man who had been dressed by someone else. Black did not suit his complexion, and discomfort twitched at the corner of his mouth as he adjusted his collar for the third time. The morning light spilled across the chapel pews in thin, uncertain beams. Miss Marple arrived early, not from devotion, but observation. She took her place near the back, as was her habit. The widow Blackwood's memorial was to be brief and conservative. The coroner's report had not yet arrived, but word had travelled nonetheless. Cyanide. A whisper, a shiver, an ugly word for but such a beautiful death. Letitia had died quickly, without noise, without ceremony, and yet, somehow, with all the drama one might expect from a woman who had always controlled her surroundings. Even in death, she had made herself the centre of every conversation. Miss Marple sat in silence as the small congregation trickled in. George Simmons entered late and theatrical, nodding too generously. Mrs. Dunthorpe came alone, in a severe black hat. The church organ wheezed its way through Abide With Me, though the notes trembled under Miss Leake's uncertain fingers. The vicar began the service. His voice was steady, but his eyes lacked conviction. Miss Marple watched him closely, not out of suspicion, at least not yet, but out of habit. He had known Letitia well. They had chaired committees together, coordinated church events, attended fundraisers, and perhaps more importantly, he had confided in her, or so Letitia had once claimed. She said he owed her something, Miss Marple recalled Emily mentioning. Something quite serious. When the hymns were done, the service dismissed, and the mourners dispersed like pigeons from a square. Miss Marple made her way slowly up the centre aisle. The vicar was gathering papers at the altar. His wife, Margaret Featherstone, stood nearby, frowning at the wilting flowers on the communion table. Such a loss, Miss Marple said quietly. Yes, the vicar replied, not quite meeting her gaze. A sudden and tragic event. Miss Marple gave a gentle smile. You knew her well, I imagine. Well enough, he replied. She knew you too, didn't she? Miss Marple tilted her head. The vicar stiffened. Mrs. Featherstone intervened with the precision of a woman used to salvaging her husband's missteps. Of course they did. Letitia was involved in every parish matter. Budget meetings, charity, fundraisers, that dreadful Flower Guild scandal last year. Miss Marple chuckled. Yes, she did have a gift for appearing helpful while collecting more than flowers. There was an uncomfortable pause. Then she added, You mentioned budget meetings. Did Letitia keep records? The vicar blinked. What do you mean? Did she ever ask to view the parish accounts? Or take copies? Mrs. Featherstone's mouth opened, then closed again. Reverend Featherstone nodded slowly. She had her own copies. She said it was best to keep the men honest. A joke, I think. I wonder, Miss Marple murmured. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the church vestry under the pretext of donating a box of wool for the Women's Comfort Committee. While there, she asked the vicar's assistant, a timid lad, named Peter Knoll, whether the old financial ledgers were still kept. He hesitated. "They're in the back filing cabinet, Miss Marple. Why?" "Just curious," she said. "In St. Mary Mead, we always kept 2 copies, one for show, one for truth." Peter laughed nervously. "I suppose Mrs. Blackwood would have appreciated that." "Quite." She didn't look at the ledgers then. It would have been too forward. But she had planted the thought, and if her instincts were correct, someone else might try to view them soon, now that Letitia was no longer around to monitor who saw what. And so she waited. That evening, just past twilight, Miss Marple took her knitting to the stone bench beside the vestry under the pretence of fresh air. She had a direct view of the narrow side door used mostly by staff. At precisely 8:47 p.m., a shadow appeared at the gate. It was Mrs. Featherstone. The vicar's wife moved carefully, not furtively, but with the sort of efficiency that only long-suffering churchwives possessed. She unlocked the door with a key she wore on a velvet ribbon around her neck. Her silhouette passed through the corridor and disappeared behind the office window. Miss Marple didn't move. She waited. 14 minutes later, Mrs. Featherstone exited, empty-handed, save for something tucked beneath her shawl. When the door clicked shut and the street emptied once more, Miss Marple rose. Not the vicar, then, she whispered to herself, but the vicar's wife. And if she was right, Mrs. Featherstone had just removed something that once belonged to Letitia Blackwood. Something worth hiding. The following morning, Miss Marple requested an audience with Inspector Rayner, the village constable. He was not an ambitious man, nor an especially clever one, but he was dutiful. His office smelled of pipe tobacco and furniture polish. He offered Miss Marple tea in a chipped mug and adjusted his belt before sitting down. "I suppose you're here about the widow Blackwood," he said. "I am. We're waiting on the final coroner's report. Initial signs suggest poison. No one's admitted to having access to anything like cyanide, but then again, you can't expect someone to confess." Miss Marple nodded. "Letitia had enemies, Inspector, but more importantly, she had knowledge." He leaned forward. "What sort of knowledge?" "The sort that lives in ledgers, in memory, in letters, perhaps. I believe someone killed her to stop something or someone from being exposed." "Do you suspect anyone?" "I suspect several people," she said calmly. "But I'm particularly interested in what the vicar's wife was doing in the vestry last night." Rayner's brow furrowed. "You saw her?" "Yes, with something concealed under her shawl. That's not a crime. Not unless it's something that wasn't hers to take." Rayner leaned back in his chair. "You think the motive's in the church's books. I think the motive lies wherever Letitia looked last. She didn't just gossip, she warned people. Her last words were meant to be a public joke. But I believe she was about to reveal something. Something someone desperately didn't want said aloud." Rayner scratched his chin. "We'll speak to Mrs. Featherstone." "She'll deny it, I imagine," Miss Marple said. "But if the ledgers are missing, or if a page has been torn, That will speak louder than she does. That night, Miss Marple sat quietly on Emily's garden swing, a shawl draped across her shoulders, a cup of cocoa in her hand. The moon was low, and somewhere in the hedge a fox called softly. She knew now that Letitia Blackwood hadn't been killed out of rage. She had been killed out of fear. And in Marley Comb, fear always came wrapped in lace and polite silence, until it didn't. The secret might be buried in a ledger, but the killer was still very much alive. And watching. Chapter 5. The Letter That Shouldn't Exist. The morning after the memorial service, Marley Comb looked deceptively calm. Rain had fallen softly during the night, leaving behind puddles that mirrored the grey clouds drifting overhead. Chimneys puffed sleepily. A cart rattled down the main lane. But beneath the surface, the village was anything but quiet. With Letitia Blackwood buried, the real digging had begun. People were speculating. About the poison, about the scone, about the possibility that the killer had been among them, laughing, singing hymns, eating egg sandwiches just feet away from the body. Miss Marple had breakfasted early. She took her tea strong and her toast slightly overdone, just as she liked it. Cousin Emily watched her over the edge of the Daily Telegraph. Rayner's visit yesterday stirred things, Emily said. Mrs. Featherstone's been in a terrible flutter. Cancelled the church flower rota, and wouldn't say why. She's rattled, Miss Marple murmured. You really think she took something from the vestry? I know she did. Emily hesitated. Do you know what it was? Not yet, but I intend to find out. She rose from the table and walked to the window. Outside, the vicar's house stood quiet and still, its curtains drawn, its rose bushes overgrown. A silence surrounded it, but not the peaceful sort, the sort that hums with tension, the kind that comes just before a storm. By late morning, Miss Marple decided to visit Dr. Pendlebury. He lived in a narrow, slanted cottage on the edge of the village green, surrounded by rose hips and medicinal herbs. His house smelled of camphor and pipe smoke. He was a squat man with red cheeks, trousers that bagged at the knees, and a tendency to speak in half-sentences. He seemed surprised to see her. Miss Marple. Nothing wrong, I hope. Not physically, she smiled. But I had a question. If you have a moment. He motioned her inside. The drawing-room was small but orderly, lined with books and jars of powders. A photograph of a stern woman, his late wife, presumably, watched them from the mantel. I assume this is about Mrs. Blackwood, he said. It is. He sat down with a grunt. The final coroner's report will confirm what we already suspect. Cyanide, concentrated, fast-acting, classic symptoms, nothing accidental about it. And no sign of ingestion method. Likely consumed during the picnic, possibly via food or drink. Might have been in the tea, or the scone. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And did you, by any chance, receive a letter from Mrs. Blackwood before her death? Pendlebury blinked. A letter? No. No warning, no strange request. He shook his head. She was due to see me for a routine checkup next week. No ailments, no complaints. I see, Miss Marple said. But something didn't sit right. Letitia Blackwood was not the sort to leave things to chance. If she had suspected danger, or had planned to reveal something, she would have prepared for it. Miss Marple left the doctor's cottage and took a long, slow walk through Marley Comb's side lanes. The rain had softened the earth. Damp leaves clung to stone walls. Her thoughts drifted, not just to Letitia's death, but to the things she might have left behind. Letters, notes, journals. A woman like Letitia didn't just collect secrets. She recorded them. It wasn't long before her thoughts took her to the one person who might have seen such a letter. Not because they were trustworthy, but because they were curious by nature. Annie Leake, the spinster organist, was known less for her music and more for her fondness for opening drawers that didn't belong to her. She lived alone in a neat row house just behind the churchyard, surrounded by porcelain figurines and calendars from 10 years ago. Miss Marple arrived unannounced. "Oh, Miss Marple," Annie said, blinking fast. "What a surprise. Not an unwelcome one, I hope." No, do come in. I was just dusting." They settled in the front sitting room. Tea was offered, not accepted. Miss Marple had no intention of staying long. "You were quite close to Mrs. Blackwood, weren't you?" she asked. "Oh, no, not really. We spoke sometimes, at choir, at committee meetings." Miss Marple smiled gently. "She often gave people little notes, didn't she? Instructions, warnings. She liked the written word." Annie twitched. "Sometimes. Yes, I heard she may have written a letter just before the picnic. Did you hear anything about that?" Annie hesitated. Her eyes flicked toward the small desk in the corner of the room. "No," she said. "Nothing like that." Miss Marple didn't press. Instead, she stood up. "Well, I won't keep you. Such a busy time, what with the funeral and all the commotion." "Oh, yes, very busy." She left the house, but as she walked away, her suspicions crystallized. There was a letter. Annie had seen it, possibly even taken it, and whatever was in it, whoever it named, was likely the reason Letitia Blackwood had died. That evening, Miss Marple invited Emily and Inspector Rayner for tea, under the pretext of discussing the flower show. The inspector arrived looking rumpled and slightly annoyed. "I hope this isn't another theory about the Featherstones," he said. "They've been most uncooperative since your last visit." Miss Marple poured him tea. "Not the Featherstones today. I want to speak about Miss Leake." Rayner raised an eyebrow. "The organist?" "Yes. I believe she has something. A letter. Possibly written by Letitia on the day she died, or shortly before. And you think it's important? I think it's why she was killed." Rayner blinked. Miss Marple continued. "Letitia had secrets, not just about others, but about herself. I suspect she planned to reveal something at the picnic. She hinted at it before collapsing. Someone panicked and acted quickly." Emily leaned forward. "Do you think she was blackmailing someone?" "I think she was warning someone," Miss Marple said softly. "And that warning, in writing, scared the wrong person." Rayner sighed. "If the letter exists and Miss Leake has it, I'll question her." "No need," Miss Marple said. "She'll hand it over, if we give her the right push." The following day, a small envelope arrived at the post office. It was addressed to Miss Marple. Inside was a single sheet of creamy paper, folded once. "Read, to whoever finds this. If anything happens to me, look to the church. The truth is buried there. And it's not the only thing." LB Miss Marple read it 3 times. She now had confirmation. Letitia had expected to be silenced, and she had pointed directly to the church as the key to the puzzle. Not the people in it, but something inside it. Chapter 6. Beneath the Floorboards of St. Agnes. The Church of St. Agnes had stood for nearly 4 centuries. Its bell tower leaned slightly to one side, giving the whole building a perpetually curious posture. The pews were carved oak, softened by time and thousands of Sunday elbows. Dust collected like devotion in the corners, and the stained glass windows threw fractured light across the stone floor like scattered rubies and sapphires. Marley Comb loved its church, not for religion necessarily, but for continuity. Babies were baptized there, marriages announced, scandals forgiven, and now, perhaps, secrets revealed. Miss Marple returned there just after dawn. She carried no handbag, no gloves, only the letter, Letitia Blackwood's final warning, folded neatly in her coat pocket. The church was empty, its doors left unlocked in the tradition of trust. The smell inside was faintly of candle wax and damp hymnals. She stood near the pulpit and looked up. The note had said, "Look to the church. The truth is buried there, and it's not the only thing." Miss Marple was not one to leap to drama. She preferred logic, quiet clues, human behaviour. But this was the first time in years that a note had truly unsettled her. She walked the perimeter of the building, the nave, the aisles, the organ loft, all familiar, all clean, but near the front pew, where the floor dipped slightly and the wood planks creaked louder than elsewhere, she paused. The boards were uneven, worn, yes, but more than that, disturbed. The nails were newer. The wood had a faint scratch pattern, as though someone had tried recently to lift it and failed. She knelt, pressed her fingers to the edge of the board, and with surprising strength lifted the corner. It gave slightly, just enough. Inside, darkness, soil, and something else, a glint of metal. She reached carefully. Her fingers touched cold brass. She lifted it. A small tin box, dented and old, the sort used decades ago for storing receipts or war medals. Inside were several folded letters, yellowing, a single faded photograph, a torn page from what looked like a church ledger, and a tiny silver. Miss Marple closed the box and stood slowly, heart tapping a strange rhythm. She replaced the board and moved back toward the vestry, as if nothing had happened. She would not inspect the contents here, not in the open, not where anyone might enter and say they'd simply come to pray. She walked back toward Emily's cottage, her mind already sorting each item by its likely significance, and the potential danger it still posed. By midday, the news had spread. "Saw her leave the church," Mrs. Beryl Cleary told the postmistress. "Said she looked positively triumphant." "Maybe she solved it," the girl whispered. "Maybe she knows who did it." She always knows. That woman sees everything. And so the pressure built again, not toward Miss Marple, but around her. She had become, without asking, the village's centre of gravity. If answers were coming, they would come through her. And if the killer was listening, and Miss Marple believed they would be watching now. Closely, that evening, Emily returned home to find her, cousin at the writing desk, reading with the stillness of a scholar examining scripture. The tin box lay open. Miss Marple held up a letter. "Typed," she said, "clumsy spacing and unsigned, but unmistakably a threat." She read aloud, "You think you're untouchable because you're clever, but even clever women can be silenced. If you open your mouth at the picnic, you'll regret. It's one word, Letitia, and it all comes down." Emily gasped. "My God, that's a death threat." Miss Marple nodded, and she kept it. She opened the second letter, this one written in Letitia's distinct looping cursive. "To whoever finds this, I've hidden the page that shows what he did. The account is false. I saw the numbers. The money vanished after the choir fundraiser. I thought he would confess. He didn't. He smiled at me like a fool." Miss Marple held up the torn ledger page. The top was labelled Choir Fundraiser, March 3. The entries below listed sums collected, donations, payments, and then one line scratched heavily with a fountain. Pendant Emily leaned closer. "But who is he?" "Someone who smiled like a fool," Miss Marple murmured. "Someone trusted with money. Someone tied to the church." Emily's face fell. "The vicar?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, he's many things, but not a thief. I believe Letitia was referring to someone else. Someone who was involved, but not in charge." She picked up the photograph. It was sepia-toned, faded. A church picnic, years ago. Letitia was younger, thinner, smiling broadly at a man standing beside her. George Simmons. In the background stood Peter Knoll, the vicar's young assistant. Two men who could access records, Miss Marple said. Two men who knew Letitia, saw too much, and only one of them was desperate enough to deliver a threat. That night Inspector Rayner arrived at Miss Marple's request. She handed him the tin box without a word. Let the evidence speak for itself. The letters, the ledger page, the key. He turned pale. This is enough to open a formal investigation. This key, I recognize it. It's from the old vestry safe, the one only staff can access. And I believe what's inside will answer everything, Miss Marple said calmly. But how did you find it? In the church, she replied, beneath the floor, as Letitia said, buried. Rayner looked at her for a long time. And the killer? Still watching, Miss Marple said, but I imagine not for long. The following day, just before sunset, the safe in the vestry was opened. Inside, under layers of old documents, they found a second ledger, a duplicate of church financial records, this one unaltered. The discrepancy was clear. £470 had disappeared from the choir fundraiser's donation total. Erased in the public copy, but present here, and signed beside the entry, in hasty ink, Peter Knoll, the vicar's assistant. When the police arrived at Peter's cottage, he did not resist. His face had collapsed into something less than guilt, more like defeat. He said nothing at first, but eventually, sitting beneath a single flickering light in the station, he broke. She said she was going to tell everyone. Said she was tired of protecting stupid boys and liars. Said she'd stand up at the picnic and speak. I didn't mean to. I just wanted to scare her. You poisoned her, Rayner said. Peter buried his face in his hands. It was only a little in her tea. I didn't know it would act so fast." Miss Marple stood behind the glass, watching quietly. She didn't look smug, only sad. That evening, Emily found her cousin back on the garden swing. She was going to forgive him, Miss Marple said suddenly. Letitia, the second letter. She said she believed Peter was scared, not cruel. She wasn't going to ruin his life, just frighten him into confession. Emily sat beside her. Then why did he— "Fear," Miss Marple whispered. "It makes people foolish. Dangerous." They sat in silence. The roses bloomed beside them, still bright, still fragrant. But something in Marley Comb had changed forever. Chapter 7. The Gossip That Outlived the Widow. One might assume, after a murder is solved and the culprit locked away, that peace returns like a tide coming in to smooth the sand. But in Marley Comb, peace didn't return. It resettled, awkwardly and unevenly, like a shawl on shoulders too burdened to hold it. Letitia Blackwood had been buried for 5 days. Her killer, Peter Knoll, the vicar's assistant, had confessed to everything in a fit of shame and trembling remorse. The money, the panic, the tea. It was all in the statement now, neat and final. And yet Marley Comb buzzed still, not because the mystery remained, but because gossip does not require mystery. It only requires memory. "I heard he tried to blame Mr. Simmons at first," whispered Mrs. Cleary as she weighed flour at the grocer. "I heard Letitia threatened to out 5 people, not just one," said Mrs. Dunthorpe as she rearranged her. "Library books by height instead of title. She had a second will, you know," declared Miss Annie Leake. "Left everything to a parrot sanctuary in Cornwall. Unnatural, that. In truth, Letitia had left a modest sum to her niece in Devon, and nothing else of consequence, save perhaps for the lingering unsettlement she'd planted in the minds of everyone she'd ever known. Even in death she had kept her power. Miss Marple, for her part, did not join in the gossip. Instead, she returned to the small habits that gave her comfort. Walks at dawn, watering Cousin Emily's fuchsias, writing letters to her niece in London, and knitting scarves no one requested, but everyone accepted. She had no interest in basking in victory. There had been no triumph in this case. Letitia Blackwood had died not because she had done wrong, but because she had tried, at the very last moment, to do something right. She had meant to forgive Peter, to protect him even, and yet he had killed her. Fear, Miss Marple knew, was the most persuasive emotion. More than love, more than hate. It drove people to poison teacups and falsify ledgers. It lived behind polite smiles and flower arrangements, and in small villages like Marley Comb, it often wore the face of secrets. It was a rainy afternoon when Miss Marple made her way back to the church for the first time since the arrest. She wore a navy coat and sensible shoes. The drizzle clung to her hat brim. She carried no umbrella. Inside, the pews sat empty. Only the smell of damp stone and faded hymnals greeted her. She moved slowly down the aisle, her hand trailing the edge of the wood. At the front pew, she paused. The same floorboard that had hidden Letitia's tin box lay in silence now, no longer loose. The vicar, embarrassed and shaken, had ordered it repaired the day after Peter's confession. Miss Marple knelt, not to inspect it again, but to acknowledge it. Not the board itself, but the choice Letitia had made. to leave something behind, to protect the truth even when no one else seemed interested in finding it. She sat in the pew for several quiet minutes. A small cough broke the silence. Turning, she saw Mrs. Margaret Featherstone, the vicar's wife, standing in the aisle, wearing a dark green raincoat and an expression that seemed caught between apology and defiance. "May I?" she asked softly. Miss Marple gestured beside her. Mrs. Featherstone sat, smoothing her skirt. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Margaret said, "You think I should have come forward?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Did you know about the missing money?" "I suspected." Letitia had said things, quiet things. She had a way of making even her silences feel accusatory. Miss Marple nodded. "I confronted Peter once," Margaret continued. "He lied, of course. But he was so young, Jane, and frightened. He reminded me of my own son. I thought perhaps it was better to let it go. And then Letitia decided not to," Miss Marple said gently. Margaret's eyes filled. She told me she was going to expose him, that it was the only way to teach him responsibility. I begged her not to. I said it would ruin him, that he'd never recover. Miss Marple said nothing. Her silence was kinder than words. "I think, in the end, she listened," Margaret whispered. "I think she planned to forgive him after the service, but she wanted to frighten him first, make him own up. She misjudged his fear." Margaret nodded. "And I misjudged hers." They sat together, two women in a cold church, with only the sound of light rain ticking against stained glass. That evening, the village newsletter arrived. A dull affair usually filled with lost cat notices and jam competition winners, but this edition bore a short obituary for Letitia Blackwood, written surprisingly by Miss Annie Leake. It read, she could be cruel with her truths and kind with her silences. She knew more than she ever said. Letitia Blackwood was not loved by all, but she made us look at ourselves more honestly than most would dare. In the end, that was her greatest gift, and her greatest danger. Miss Marple read it twice, then folded the paper and tucked it into her book of pressed violets. The following Sunday, Miss Marple packed her suitcase. Emily hovered nearby, trying not to look sentimental. "You'll be missed," she said. "I'll be back," Jane promised. "Marley Comb doesn't let go of its ghost so easily." Emily smiled. "It's strange, though. You came for a rest, and instead you solved a murder." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "The village gave me more than I expected." Emily paused. "And did it give you peace?" Miss Marple looked out the window. Across the road, the widow Blackwood's house stood empty now. Ivy was reclaiming the shutters. A single light bulb still flickered in the upper hallway, as if her presence hadn't quite left. "No," Miss Marple said, "but it gave me understanding. And sometimes, in villages like Marley Comb, that was the best one could hope for." Chapter 8. A visit from the niece in Devon. Was a softer thing in Devon. When Miss Marple arrived at her niece Margaret's home, in the small seaside village of Sulcombe, she was greeted by the scent of salt water and warm scones. The change of scenery, she thought, might be just what she needed after the emotional turbulence of Marley Comb. Devon was not unlike St. Mary Mead, at least in its rural charm, but it was quieter, calmer, and less clouded by the weight of people's pasts. Here, the greatest scandal was a neighbour's garden fence that had fallen down, and even that had been resolved with a few cups of tea and a polite apology. But as she sat by the fire that first evening, sipping tea and listening to her niece's gentle chatter about the goings-on of Swirling, Miss Marple found her mind drifting back to Marley Comb. Emily had written a letter only yesterday, a brief update on the village. The flowers had begun blooming again around St. Agnes's Church, and there had been a gathering of the Women's Comfort Committee. Life was moving forward, albeit with a hesitant pace. The tragedy of Letitia Blackwood's death had shocked everyone. And though Peter Noel had been caught, the reverberations of his actions lingered. Margaret was watching her aunt carefully, no doubt sensing her quiet distance. "You're not quite here, are you?" she asked softly. Miss Marple gave a small smile. "Physically, yes, but I am still tethered to Marley Comb, I'm afraid." "I thought that might be it," Margaret said with a thoughtful frown. "Is it because of what happened with the widow?" "The death? Yes, but not just the death," Miss Marple said, looking into the flames. "It was the quiet way Letitia held everything together, and the fear it created. I think there were more secrets buried than we even know about." Margaret set her teacup down. "You think there's more to the story?" Miss Marple nodded. "I do. You see, dear, Letitia Blackwood may have been killed because she planned to reveal the truth. But there were truths she had kept hidden for so long, ones that people, even in Marley Comb, would never wish to acknowledge." The following morning, Miss Marple took a walk along the cliffs near Swirling, her boots crunching softly against the gravel. She had no specific destination in mind, but the air was crisp, and the view was open. A stark contrast to the dense hedgerows of Marley Comb. She walked. The letter from Letitia still weighed on her mind. The warning letter she had written just days before her death had been cryptic, but it was clear that Letitia had seen something coming, something that no one else had been able to stop. When she reached the edge of a small cove, she paused to watch the waves crash against the rocks. The sea was vast, always shifting, always changing. It reminded her of the way things were in the village. People moved in and out of Marley Comb like the tides. The gossip, the secrets, the fears, they all came and went. But some things remained beneath the surface, hidden. And then there was the key, the little silver key that had been tucked into the tin box hidden under the floorboards. It had stayed in her pocket ever since, a strange, small thing that had meant so much in the final moments of Letitia's life. What did it open? The question had lingered in her thoughts like a puzzle half solved. When Miss Marple returned to Margaret's home that afternoon, her niece was waiting with a fresh batch of scones and a cup of tea. But Miss Marple had only one thing on her mind. "I think it's time I returned to Marley Comb," she said quietly. "There are still pieces of the puzzle that need to be put in place." Margaret looked at her with a mix of concern and resignation. "I knew you'd say that." "I have to," Miss Marple replied. "There's something unfinished there, something important that wasn't resolved with Peter's confession." "Will you go alone?" Margaret asked, her voice soft. "Yes," Miss Marple said with a small smile, "but I'll take my time. A few more days, perhaps. The village can wait. There's no rush, but I must finish what I started." That evening, Miss Marple boarded the train back to Marley Comb, her thoughts swirling. She had not yet spoken to Emily about the tin box or the letters it contained. She was waiting for the right moment. But in her heart, Miss Marple knew that the truth had already begun to emerge in bits and pieces. The village had a way of holding secrets, of keeping them, even when they seemed long buried. But Letitia Blackwood had left one final clue behind, and Miss Marple was certain that whoever had killed her would not have been content until the truth was completely sealed. She stepped off the train in Marley Comb at dusk, the cool breeze reminding her that this village had never really let go of its ghosts. The next morning, as she entered the churchyard again, Miss Marple was greeted by the familiar faces of the villagers. They smiled politely, but Miss Marple knew they still carried their unspoken burdens. She had already noticed a change in the atmosphere, something subtle but unmistakable. She made her way to the vestry, past the gravestones that seemed to whisper their stories to the wind. Inside, she stood before the old safe, the one that had been emptied so hastily after Peter's confession. Her hand hovered over the cold metal. It was still locked, but now it seemed less of a mystery and more of a door. Miss Marple had come to the conclusion that the key was meant for this. The tin box, the letters, the ledger. They were all parts of the same story. A story that began with a betrayal, continued with secrets, and ended with a death. She inserted the silver key into the lock, her fingers steady despite the rush of anticipation in her chest. It turned. The safe door creaked open. Inside, she found more than she expected. The contents were not documents. They were old church records, much older than the ones she had seen in the office. These were from the late 1800s, and they contained something no one had thought to investigate before. A list of names, and beside each name, a sum of money. Miss Marple closed the door slowly. She had found what she needed. It was not just the murder of Letitia Blackwood that had been covered up. The village had been living with its own series of secrets, involving money, land, and a past that was now suddenly very much alive. Chapter 9. The Hidden Ledger of Marley Comb. The following morning, the village of Marley Comb was shrouded in a quiet fog, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. Miss Marple had spent the night in her cottage, staring at the church records she had found in the hidden safe. Each name on that list had been like a thread, one she had pulled until it unravelled a deeper, darker secret. The money, the names, the dates, they all tied back to the very people who had seemed so ordinary, so innocent in the light of day. But the records were incomplete. There were references to accounts, payments made by people Miss Marple knew well, from the most influential families in the village to the more reclusive, quiet types who rarely ventured beyond their own gardens. But the ledger didn't tell the full story. It was a trail, not a map, a hint, not a conclusion. She needed to know more, and she knew exactly who to ask. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to George Simmons's house. Though he had been at the heart of the gossip surrounding Letitia's death, he remained an enigma. His carefully curated image, the sharp cut, suits, the aloof smile, they were all meant to mask something. What? That Miss Marple wasn't sure. But she intended to find out. Simmons' house, a townhouse on Larkspur Lane, was meticulously kept. The curtains were always drawn, the front door always locked, and the plants in the window boxes were arranged with the kind of precision that suggested more than simple habit. Miss Marple knocked once, waited, and then knocked again. There was no answer, but she hadn't expected one. The sound of footsteps approached from inside. The door opened, revealing George Simmons in a tailored waistcoat, his dark hair combed neatly back. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth, but not without a hint of unease. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I've come for a brief chat," Miss Marple said, her voice pleasant but firm. "May I come in?" He hesitated, his eyes darting toward the hallway, then back to her. "I suppose if you must." She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, noting the cold, clinical cleanliness of the house. It smelled faintly of tobacco and old leather-bound books, but there was no warmth here, no hint of comfort. The furniture was angular and modern, the carpets unmarked. There were no family photographs on the walls, no personal mementos. It was a home for someone who had never intended to stay. Simmons led her to a sitting room at the back of the house, a room with an open view of the well-kept garden. He offered her a seat and poured 2 cups of tea, though she had no intention of drinking it. "So, Miss Marple," he said, leaning back in his chair, "to what do I owe this unexpected visit?" "I've been going through some old records," Miss Marple began. "You know, the ones in the church." He stiffened, his fingers briefly tightening around his teacup. "I suppose you could say that," he replied coolly. "What about them?" "I noticed something rather interesting," Miss Marple continued, watching him closely. "It seems there were several payments made to a mysterious fund, contributions from the families of the village, if you will." "Is that so?" George Simmons's smile remained in place, though it didn't reach his eyes. "What's so interesting about that?" "Well, among the names listed, I found yours," Miss Marple said, her tone never faltering. "But then I also found a discrepancy in the records. A rather sizable donation from your family, more than the others, I might add." He exhaled sharply, a flicker of unease crossing his features. "I don't see what relevance that has to anything," he said, his voice tight. "It's a simple donation." "Is it?" Miss Marple asked. "Or was it an investment? A guarantee?" Its gaze darkened. "What are you implying, Miss Marple?" "I'm implying that Letitia Blackwood may have known more than she ever let on. I'm also implying that you, Mr. Simmons, might have had far more to lose than anyone knew." For the first time since she'd entered the room, his mask slipped. His eyes narrowed and his jaw clenched. He set his teacup down with deliberate precision, his gaze no longer playful, but sharp and calculating. "I don't know what game you're playing, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "but I suggest you stop. You're barking up the wrong tree." "I'm not playing any games, Mr. Simmons," Miss Marple replied calmly. "I'm simply trying to understand what Letitia Blackwood had planned to say. She was the one who knew things, remember? The one who had all the answers. I think she had something on you, something far more significant than anyone realizes." Rose suddenly, and the suddenness of his motion startled her. He walked to the window, looking out over the garden before turning back to face her. I don't have time for this," he muttered, his voice thick with anger. Miss Marple stood as well, her expression unchanged. "And I don't have time for evasion, Mr. Simmons. So, if you want to keep your secrets, you'll have to do better than that." She turned and left before he could stop her. As the door clicked shut behind her, she heard him curse quietly to himself. As she walked back down the narrow lane, Miss Marple's thoughts were racing. George Simmons had been hiding something. That much was clear. But what? Her gut told her. It wasn't just the money. It was something far more personal, something that could unravel everything. Not just for him, but for the entire village. The clues were all there. In the church records, in the hidden tin box, in Letitia's letters. It all led back to the same place. And now that she had George Simmons cornered, she only had to figure out what he was hiding. As Miss Marple reached the gate to Emily's cottage, she turned, looking back toward the house she had just left. The puzzle was beginning to come together, but there was still a piece missing, and she was going to find it. Chapter 10. The Broken Mirror of Marley Comb. The following morning, the village of Marley Comb was still and quiet, as if waiting for something that had yet to arrive. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and early autumn flowers. Yet, in the very core of the village, something had shifted. Something deep and unsettling that no one could quite put into words. Miss Marple had just returned from her visit to George Simmons. She had left his house with a sense of quiet victory. Not because he had confessed, no, not yet, but because she now knew the full extent of his involvement in the village's financial discrepancies. Her conversation with him had been illuminating, though it had not yielded the confessions she had hoped for. His unease had been palpable, and his temper barely restrained. Miss Marple could almost hear his thoughts turning over in his mind as he tried to reconcile the parts of himself he had hidden so carefully. But now Miss Marple was ready. The pieces were all there. The church records, the letters, the money, the missing keys. It was all laid before her like a broken mirror, each fragment reflecting a different truth. That afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage. The vicar, Reverend Featherstone, had been a quiet presence in the village, a man of routine whose sermons were soothing rather than profound. But recently he had become more distant. He had avoided Miss Marple's questions about the finances, and he had shown little emotion after Letitia Blackwood's death. He had taken it in stride, like someone who was accustomed to keeping his distance from the messier aspects of life. But now it was time to bring everything into the light. Miss Marple stood before the vicar's door and knocked twice, her hand steady on the polished brass knocker. The door opened a moment later, and Reverend Featherstone's face appeared in the crack, his features tight with caution. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice betraying no surprise. "I wasn't expecting you." "May I come in, Reverend?" Miss Marple asked, her tone polite but insistent. He stepped back and gestured for her to enter, but his eyes remained wary, watching her every move. She followed him into the drawing-room, where a fire flickered in the hearth, casting long shadows on the walls. It was a warm room, but the atmosphere felt strangely cold. "I trust you are well, Miss Marple?" Reverend Featherstone asked, as he motioned for her to sit. "I am," Miss Marple replied, settling into the armchair opposite him. I've come to speak about something I've discovered, something that has been hidden in this village for a very long time." The vicar stiffened, his hands fumbling with the edge of his collar, as though trying to adjust it, but unable to do so. He didn't speak for a long moment, as though considering his words carefully. "I'm afraid I don't follow, Miss Marple," he said finally, his voice a little too smooth. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "I think you do, Reverend. You've been involved in something very delicate, something that, if revealed, would change everything about this village." The young vicar's eyes widened briefly, but he quickly regained his composure. "What exactly are you insinuating?" "I'm not insinuating anything, Reverend," Miss Marple replied quietly. "I'm simply stating facts. The records at the church have been altered. There was money, significant amounts of money that disappeared, money that should have been accounted for." Reverend Featherstone's jaw tightened. He placed his hands on the edge of the mantelpiece, his knuckles white. "Money? What money are you talking about?" "Donations, Reverend. Donations made to the church, particularly for the choir fundraiser. And I've discovered that several key people were involved in misappropriating those funds." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped away from the mantelpiece and moved toward the window, staring out at the fog that had begun to creep in from the sea. "I had no choice," he said, almost to himself. Miss Marple stood, her eyes sharp. "No choice? Was it desperation that led you to cover up what had been done, or was it something else?" The vicar turned back toward her, his eyes hollow. "It was Letitia Blackwood who pushed me into it. She knew everything. She was the one who had all the proof." "Proof of what?" Miss Marple asked. "The missing money, and the fact that I had taken it. She confronted me with it a month ago. She said she would expose me, destroy everything I had worked for, unless I agreed to certain conditions." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "What conditions?" Reverend Featherstone's voice was barely above a whisper. "She wanted me to leave, to stop being the vicar. She said she would expose me to the bishop unless I agreed to leave the village quietly. It wasn't just the money, Miss Marple. It was the secrets I kept, the affair, the lies, the things I had hidden. I couldn't face being caught. Not by her." Miss Marple took a deep breath. "And so you did what?" "I gave her the money," he said. "I paid her off, hoping she would leave me alone. I thought that would be the end of it." "But it wasn't, was it?" Miss Marple said softly. "She threatened to reveal everything. You knew she would. And then she died." Reverend Featherstone nodded slowly. "Yes, I thought she was going to reveal it at the picnic. She had it all planned out, Miss Marple. She was going to say it in front of everyone at the feast, but she never got the chance." "And so," Miss Marple continued, her voice calm, "you decided to act, to silence her before she could expose you." He didn't reply, but the guilt was written plainly across his face. Miss Marple leaned back. "You were too afraid of the truth, Reverend, but in trying to protect yourself, you've only made things worse." Reverend Featherstone's hands trembled as he sat back down, his face drawn and defeated. "I thought I could cover it up. I thought I could make it go away. But Letitia, she was too clever. She saw everything. She had all the pieces. And I knew that if she spoke, it would all fall apart." Miss Marple stood silently, her mind working through the final steps. The truth had been laid bare before her. It had been in the church records, in the letters Letitia had kept, in the stolen funds. It was not just Letitia's death that had needed solving. It was the years of secrets, of lies and betrayals that had bound this village together in an unspoken pact of fear. The letter she left, Miss Marple said, it was her last warning. She wasn't just going to expose you. She was going to expose the others too, the ones who were involved in these illegal transactions. And you couldn't let that happen, could you? Reverend Featherstone's face crumpled. No, I couldn't. That afternoon, the police arrived. Reverend Featherstone was arrested quietly, without fanfare. The evidence was overwhelming. The missing money, the confession, the church records. And in the quiet, sombre air of the church, the final pieces of the mystery were put into place. But Marley Comb was still haunted. The villagers went about their daily lives, but Miss Marple knew the truth had cracked open the delicate surface of their world. The story would remain with them forever. A tale of greed, deception, and a village that had kept its eyes closed for far too long. Chapter 11. The Cost of Silence. Marley Comb was returning to its natural rhythm, the aftermath of the Reverend. Featherstone's arrest had left its mark on the village, but not in the way one might expect. There were no dramatic confrontations, no tearful confessions in the street. There was, instead, a strange, pervasive quiet, as though everyone had come to terms with something that had been buried too long. Secrets that had festered in corners and behind closed doors were now out in the open, yet nothing had truly changed in the way the villagers lived their lives. Miss Marple stood by the window of Emily's cottage, looking out at the village green. It was a view she had come to know well during her time in Marley Comb. There, the children still ran barefoot after a ball. The grocer still peddled his wares, and the local tavern, despite whispers of scandal, still rang with the clink of coins. But everything felt slightly different now. The tension that had been present in the air before Letitia Blackwood's murder had lifted, but the weight of the truth remained. The truth about money, about secrets, about the past Marley Comb had tried to leave behind. The death of Letitia had uncovered far more than the village had been prepared for. What had started as a single case of poisoned tea had unearthed a buried network of corruption and an unsettling truth. The village's carefully crafted illusions had been shattered. Everyone had been playing a part in keeping the lie intact, whether by omission, ignorance, or simple pride. "Jane," Emily said softly, standing behind her cousin. "Are you leaving soon?" Miss Marple turned, offering her cousin a faint smile. "Soon, yes, it's time." Emily's face was tight, as though she were holding something back. "I don't understand," she said finally. "How can you leave knowing what you know? Knowing what they've done? I can't shake the feeling that it's all too much, that maybe we didn't really know anyone in Marley Comb at all." Miss Marple paused, considering Emily's words. The younger woman had always been perceptive, and her discomfort was not surprising. The village had been a sanctuary of sorts, a place where everything seemed to belong in its neat little box. But now Emily was seeing the cracks in the surface. "The truth," Miss Marple said gently, "has a way of doing that. We look at the world, and we think we understand it, think we know the people around us. But it's not until something is forced out into the open that we realize how little we truly know. But they're still here, Emily protested. The same people. They didn't change. They just got caught. Miss Marple turned back to the window. Perhaps. Or perhaps they have changed without realizing it. Once the truth is known, it can never be unsaid. People may carry it with them, whether they admit it or not. Even if they think they've moved on, there's always a shadow. Emily looked down at her hands, folding and unfolding the hem of her cardigan nervously. But the vicar, he's gone. The money's been returned. That should be the end of it, shouldn't it? Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. But the true cost of silence is not just the money. It's the damage it does to people's souls, to their peace of mind. The next morning, Miss Marple visited the graveyard for the last time. The fog had rolled in once again, thick and grey, casting an eerie stillness over the tombstones. It was here, beneath the shadow of St. Agnes's church, that the true history of Marley Comb had been buried. The grave of Letitia Blackwood had already been tended to by the village caretakers. Fresh flowers lay in a neat arrangement at the base of the stone. But Miss Marple did not pause at the grave. Instead, she stood before the weathered memorial of an older family, the Norringtons. A name long forgotten by the current villagers, but still whispered among the older generations. As she stood there, her mind wandered back to the things Letitia had known. The woman had been more than just a gossip. She had been a witness, a keeper of the village's deepest secrets, secrets that, if left hidden, might have continued to fuel the cycle of fear and manipulation that had long governed the lives of Marley Comb's residents. Some people are better off knowing the truth, Miss Marple said to herself. Others never truly want to hear it. Her thoughts shifted to Peter Noel, the young assistant who had been so afraid. He was now in the care of the police, awaiting trial. He had acted out of fear of being exposed, of losing his position, but his actions had been driven by the same thing that had pushed so many others in the village, the need to hide. And what was the result? A death, a life ruined, and the village forever changed. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple returned to Emily's cottage, her mind still processing the final revelations. She had spoken with the police one last time, ensuring that everything Letitia had left behind, the letters, the church records, had been properly recorded and filed. Nothing more would be said, nothing more needed to be done. But Miss Marple knew the truth would linger. It always did. "Are you leaving tomorrow?" Emily asked as Miss Marple entered. "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "It's time to return to St. Mary Mead." Emily's brow furrowed. "You're not staying longer?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, my work here is done, and I believe you are ready to carry on. Marley Comb will heal, slowly, quietly, but it will heal." As Miss Marple boarded the early morning train the next day, she cast one final glance out the window at the village she had come to know so well. Marley Comb had been through so much, yet it was not so different from the world beyond. People who lived with secrets, with fears, with mistakes. People who tried, above all, to bury the parts of themselves they most feared. But Miss Marple knew better than anyone. The truth doesn't stay buried forever. It rises, it whispers, and one day it will demand to be heard, and sometimes it takes unto the simple, quiet observer to make sure it is. Chapter 12. The Return to St. Mary Mead. The train from Marley Comb to St. Mary Mead was quiet, as all good journeys should be. The countryside passed by in streaks of green and gold, the gentle hum of the train's wheels matching the rhythmic beat of Miss Marple's thoughts. She sat by the window, her hands folded in her lap, a small leather bag beside her, and the soft murmur of other passengers a distant background noise. Though it had only been a few days since the murder had been solved, the village of Marley Comb already felt like a lifetime ago. The faces of its residents, the vicar, the widow, the assistant, and even the ones who had known nothing of the drama unfolding around them, all seemed to blur in Miss Marple's memory. She had come to understand them, to see their weaknesses and fears, their secrets and their truths. But now it was time to leave. As the train chugged closer to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. There was something infinitely comforting about the familiar sights of home, the neat little cottage where she had lived for so many years, the tidy gardens where her flowers bloomed without fail, and the peaceful village that never seemed to change. It was always there, waiting for her. She had learned many things in Marley Comb, things about people, about secrets, and about the quiet weight of fear that could bind a village together. But she had also learned something that gave her peace. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is watch, to observe, to wait. Because in the end, the truth always comes to light, whether you are ready for it or not. St. Mary Mead welcomed her, as it always did, with a soft breeze and the scent of fresh bread from the bakery. The streets were as calm as she remembered, the people as familiar as ever. There were no mysteries here, no unsolved crimes. No one was hiding anything, or so it seemed. Miss Marple made her way home, feeling a quiet satisfaction in the rhythm of her steps. She entered her cottage, the door creaking slightly, as it always did. Inside, everything was as she had left it. The neat piles of books, the curtains drawn just so, the faint smell of lavender from the potpourri she kept on the mantel. Her thoughts, however, lingered on one final thing, the letter. It had been Letitia Blackwood's last warning, the cryptic note that had hinted at more secrets to uncover. Miss Marple had read it many times during her stay in Marley Comb, trying to make sense of the disjointed lines and faded ink. There was something in the way it had been written, in the urgency of the words that had stayed with her, and though she knew the truth of Letitia's death and the murder that had followed, the letter still felt incomplete. She opened the small drawer in her writing desk and pulled out the envelope, its edges worn from too many readings. The letter was still there, folded neatly, tucked among her other personal papers. She read it once more. To whoever finds this, I've hidden the page that shows what he did. The account is false. I saw the numbers. The money vanished after the choir fundraiser. I thought he would confess. He didn't. He smiled at me like a fool. Miss Marple ran a finger along the faded paper. The letter was a puzzle. The missing page, the false account. It had been written, with the understanding that someone would eventually find it. But who was she referring to? And what had Letitia known that others had tried so desperately to hide? The next morning, Miss Marple went to visit her old friend, Mrs. Barton, the village's retired schoolteacher. Mrs. Barton had been a constant in Miss Marple's life, someone who always seemed to know more than she let on. If anyone in the village had a sense of the past, it was Mrs. Barton. "Ah, Miss Marple," she greeted her at the door, her hands resting on the handle of her walking stick. "Back from Marley Comb, I hear. Did you solve another mystery then?" Miss Marple smiled. "Something like that. But I have a question for you, Mrs. Barton. Do you remember anything about the Norrington family?" Mrs. Barton's eyebrows lifted slightly. "The Norringtons? Oh, yes. They were well known around here years ago. The father was an investor in the local industries. He and his wife were often seen at church, but they were always very quiet, not the type to share much." Miss Marple nodded. "And what about their son, the younger Mr. Norrington?" A faint shadow crossed Mrs. Barton's face. "Ah, yes, Edmund Norrington, a charming man in his youth, but he disappeared from St. Owain, Mary Mead, many years ago. No one ever knew exactly where he went, but he was always very private." Miss Marple's mind clicked into place. Edmund Norrington. The name had come up in the old records she had found in the church. He was the one who had donated the large sum of money to the church fund, but no one seemed to know where he had gone. Miss Marple had long suspected that there was something more to the story. "I believe Edmund Norrington may be connected to the events in Marley Comb," Miss Marple said quietly. "The missing funds, the secrets, the people involved, they all point back to him." Mrs. Barton looked thoughtful. "He was a clever one, Edmund, always kept to himself. But now that you mention it, I do recall some strange rumours about him. Some said he was involved in business dealings that weren't entirely above board." "Could you help me find him?" Miss Marple asked, her voice steady. Mrs. Barton smiled softly. "I might have a few old records that could point the way. Edmund left his mark here in St. Mary Mead, even if he's gone now. We'll see what we can uncover." Over the next few days, Miss Marple and Mrs. Barton scoured the village records, piecing together what they could about Edmund Norrington's past. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. Edmund had been deeply involved in local finances, and he had connections to several influential families in the area. But something had gone wrong. He had vanished, leaving behind a tangled web of lies and unaccounted for money. It didn't take long for Miss Marple to piece together the final part of the puzzle. Edmund Norrington had been the one to orchestrate the financial fraud that Letitia Blackwood had uncovered. The missing funds from the choir fundraiser, the false accounts, the donations that had disappeared. It had all been part of a larger scheme to cover up his embezzlement. And when Letitia had threatened to expose him, he had panicked, knowing that his carefully constructed world would collapse if anyone discovered the truth. But in his desperation, he had made one fatal mistake. He had underestimated Letitia Blackwood's ability to hold on to the truth, and he had underestimated her willingness to reveal it. As Miss Marple sat in the quiet garden of Emily's cottage, watching the final rays of the setting sun cast long shadows across the lawn, she felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The mystery had been solved. The killer had been brought to justice. The village would go on, though it would never be quite the same. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her gaze drifting to the distant hills. The world was a strange place, full of secrets, lies, and things left unsaid. But for now, at least, she could rest. Marley Comb's ghosts were no longer haunting anyone. Chapter 13. A Peaceful Departure. The village of Marley Comb had returned to a kind of calm that only the passage of time could bring. It had been nearly a week since Peter Noel had been arrested, his confession bringing an end to the mystery that had gripped the village for months. The murder of Letitia Blackwood, the missing money, and the tangled web of secrets surrounding the church. It was all behind them now, buried like the dust of old secrets that had no place in the daylight. The funeral had been a quiet affair, and the village had resumed its rhythm. For Miss Marple, the days had been spent in the same quiet routine she had always known. The village itself had become a quieter place, not because of the resolution of the case, but because of the settling that had occurred. The fears that had once clouded the air, the whispers that had fluttered in the corners of the rooms, had dissipated. People were still watching each other, still keeping to their old ways, but there was no longer the same sense of looming danger. The truth had been revealed, and though it had shaken Marley Comb to its core, it had also given it something else. Clarity. The letter that Letitia had written had done its work. The pieces had fallen into place. The murderer was behind bars, and the village was no longer under the suffocating weight of secrets. For now, at least, the air was clear. On her final day in Marley Comb, Miss Marple took her time. She walked slowly through the village, pausing at the familiar corners, observing the people who had once seemed so enclosed. The grocer waved as she passed. Mrs. Cleary gave her a nod, and the children, unburdened by the weight of history, played as children always did. In the churchyard, she stood before the gravestone of Letitia Blackwood. The headstone had been placed with quiet dignity, and the flowers that still adorned it spoke to the village's ongoing respect for the woman, despite the complications of her death. "Goodbye, Letitia," Miss Marple whispered. "You were more than you seemed. You saw more than anyone knew. I hope, wherever you are, you've found peace." She lingered for a moment longer, then turned to leave. There was nothing more to say, nothing left to do. By the time she returned to Emily's cottage, her suitcase was packed, and the train ticket to St. Mary Mead lay neatly on the side table. The decision to leave had been made long ago, but now, as the time approached, Miss Marple felt the faintest hint of regret, not for the case. That had been resolved. Not for the village, though it had certainly left its mark, but for the quiet life she had left behind, for the simple joys of sitting in her own little home, of knitting by the fire, of watching the seasons change without, feeling the weight of someone else's secrets pressing on her heart. "Everything's ready, Jane," Emily said as she stepped into the living room. "I didn't expect you to be in such a hurry." Miss Marple smiled, though it was a quiet smile, touched with the understanding that had been growing in her heart over the past few days. "I'm not in a hurry, Emily," she said softly, "but sometimes it's time. We all have our places, and mine is St. Mary Mead." "I understand," Emily said, nodding. "You've solved the case. You've done what you came to do." Miss Marple paused and looked at her cousin for a moment. "No, Emily. I came here to understand. The case, yes, but more than that, to understand the people. The way we all carry our secrets, our fears, and our histories." "And do you understand now?" Emily asked, her voice quiet. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I do. People are always more complicated than they seem. The village, the people. We all wear masks, don't we? But the truth always shows through one way or another." That evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the village in soft golden light, Miss Marple stood by the window, gazing out at the familiar landscape, the cottages with their smoke curling from chimneys, the children still playing in the distance, and the quiet streets that had once felt so full of secrets now felt almost empty. And yet, it was an emptiness that carried peace with it. The village had been through something, but it would survive. People would remember, of course. They would always remember Letitia Blackwood and the secrets she had taken with her to the grave. But the lesson had been learned. Marley Comb was a place that could bear its burdens, but only when they were acknowledged, when the weight of the truth had finally been lifted. At the train station the next morning, Emily stood with Miss Marple on the platform, her face quiet but filled with unspoken understanding. "You'll come back?" Emily asked. Miss Marple smiled and nodded. "Of course, but for now, it's time for me to go home." Emily reached out and squeezed her hand. "Safe travels, Jane, and thank you for everything." Miss Marple's smile deepened. "It was my pleasure, Emily. Take care of yourself. Take care of Marley Comb." The train began to pull into the station, and Miss Marple turned toward it, her bag in hand, her posture straight. She was not leaving the village with a sense of closure, alone. She was leaving with the understanding that life, though full of mysteries, was also full of second chances. As the train began to roll away, she looked out the window, watching the village fade into the distance. The tracks stretched out ahead, leading her back to St. Mary Mead, where new days and quiet evenings awaited. And she knew, as she always had, that the mysteries of the world, the hidden truths, the buried secrets, would never stop. They would always be there, just beneath the surface. But it was her work, her quiet watching, that would ensure the truth always came to light. Chapter 14. The Last Puzzle Piece. Mary Mead was as it always had been. Miss Marple's return was a quiet one, almost unnoticed by the townspeople, whose lives had gone on without pause. The train station had seen only a few travellers come and go. The local shops still smelled of fresh bread and faintly of old books. The villagers still met for tea in the afternoons, and the children still played in the same old lanes where gossip spread like wildfire. But beneath the familiar calm, a subtle shift had occurred in the world that Miss Marple had returned to. It had been a long journey. A journey that had taken her from one village to another, from one set of secrets to another, from the comfortable routine of her life in St. Mary Mead to the unsettling revelations of Marley Comb. She had been drawn into that quiet corner of the world to solve a murder. Yes, but more than that, to understand the people who had lived alongside her, even in a place as seemingly tranquil as Marley Comb. As she walked down the familiar path to her cottage, Miss Marple took a moment to look around. The air was cool, the last remnants of summer fading into autumn, the trees shedding their leaves in soft patterns on the ground. Nothing in St. Mary Mead had truly changed, but she had. That evening, as Miss Marple sat in her favourite armchair, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, she felt the weight of the last few weeks settle into her bones. The case in Marley Comb had been resolved, but the journey of understanding, the real work, had been far more complicated than she had anticipated. In Marley Comb, Miss Marple had uncovered something she hadn't expected. Not just a killer, but a village at war with its own past. Fear and secrecy had ruled Marley Comb for years, festering beneath its charming exterior. People had hidden their fears behind polite smiles, their regrets behind closed doors, and the widow, Letitia Blackwood, had known it all, had seen it all, and had tried to pull the threads of the village's tangled web loose, only to be silenced before she could. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the letter she had discovered. In Marley Comb, Letitia's final warning. The letter had hinted at something far deeper than simple murder. It had pointed to the history of Marley Comb, to the way secrets had been kept, to the truths that had been buried beneath the surface for generations. The village was no different from the rest of the world. It was filled with human frailty, with mistakes that had been passed down like family heirlooms, each generation adding to the burden. But now, the truth had been revealed, and with it came a measure of peace, though it was a peace that came only after the truth had been fully laid bare. It was only when Miss Marple sat down with a cup of tea in her garden the next morning that she began to understand the full scope of the lesson Marley Comb had given her. The village had been a mirror, reflecting not just the people within it, but the world beyond. The world Miss Marple had always known, where secrets and lies were part of the human condition. People were always hiding something, whether it was a crime, a mistake, or a fear they couldn't face. But truth, Miss Marple knew, was not like that. Truth had a way of pushing its way out into the open, no matter how hard people tried to keep it hidden. It was the force that cut through the lies, the thing that always found its way, like water trickling through the cracks of a dam. The key to the mystery in Marley Comb had not been the murder. It had been the truth about money, about lies, about hidden emotions and secret fears. And Miss Marple, as always, had seen through it all, her quiet observation and understanding guiding her to the solution. But there was something else, something that had lingered with her since the very beginning, a piece of the puzzle that she had never fully understood until now. That afternoon, Miss Marple received a letter from Emily in Marley Comb. The contents were brief but significant. Dear Jane, I wanted to tell you something I didn't mention before. After everything had settled down, I found something in the attic. An old trunk that belonged to my grandmother. Inside it, I found letters that hadn't been opened for decades. Letters from the Norrington family. I don't know how I missed them before, but they seem to explain everything. It's all about money again. The money that never quite made it to the church. I'll write more when I can. Yours, Emily. Miss Marple put the letter down slowly, her mind already racing. Emily had found the missing piece. The Norrington family had been involved all along, their money secretly redirected, their debts silently carried by the villagers who had never questioned the status quo. The Norringtons had once been the stewards of Marley Comb's wealth, their dealings quietly influencing the village's finances. But they had hidden more than money. They had hidden the truth. And now the truth was beginning to surface. Emily's discovery would complete the puzzle that had eluded Miss Marple for so long. She hadn't just solved a murder. She had uncovered the history of a village that had lived in the shadows for far too long. As the day came to a close, Miss Marple sat back in her chair, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over her. The fire had burned low, and the soft hum of the evening wind carried the distant sound of the church bell tolling. She had solved the mystery of Marley Comb. But more than that, she had found something deeper. The understanding that no secret, no matter how carefully guarded, could ever remain hidden forever. And that was the most important lesson of all. For a moment, Miss Marple allowed herself a rare feeling, a sense of completion. The puzzle had been solved. The last piece had been found. And though the world would continue, with its secrets and lies, Miss Marple could rest easy, knowing that she had, once again, brought the truth to light. Chapter 15. The Epilogue of Marley Comb. As the days passed in St. Mary Mead, the weight of the past few months began to lift from Miss Marple's shoulders, but only slightly. The village felt more serene, yet the memory of Marley Comb lingered in the quiet moments. In the flicker of candlelight, the soft murmur of village gossip, and the rustle of the evening wind through the trees. It was not a place that could be easily forgotten, for the truths revealed there had not only altered its people, but had also left an indelible mark on the quiet detective herself. The case was closed. The truth about Letitia Blackwood, Peter Knoll, George Simmons, and the Norrington family had all been uncovered, each piece falling into place with the meticulous care Miss Marple had always applied to her work. But there was one thing, perhaps, that had remained unspoken. The very nature of secrets, and why people so desperately cling to them. Miss Marple had seen them all in Marley Comb. The secrets of the vicar's finances, of the church records, of hidden relationships, and the suffocating fear that gripped people as they tried to cover their tracks. And yet, the more secrets people tried to hide, the more they found themselves cornered by the truth. She had always known that the truth would come to light. It was inevitable. But what intrigued her most about the whole case was how people reacted to it. Some ran from the truth, some tried to deny it, and some, like Letitia Blackwood, took it upon themselves to drag it out into the open. One afternoon, as she sat in the drawing-room of her cottage, Miss Marple reflected on the letter she had received from Emily in Marley Comb. The Norrington family's involvement in the scandal had been the final missing link, and with Emily's discovery of their old letters, Miss Marple had come to understand just how deep the roots of corruption and secrecy ran in the village. The Norringtons had left their mark on Marley Comb for years, shaping its history through their control of finances and power. The missing money, the altered records, and the blackmail. It had all been a way for them to protect their wealth, to keep their secrets hidden. But once Letitia had uncovered the truth, once the villagers had started talking, the past had come rushing back, unravelling everything the Norringtons had tried so carefully to hide. Miss Marple knew, however, that in the end it was not just the money or the deception that had caused the greatest damage. It was the fear that had made people act in ways they would never have thought themselves capable of. Fear that had silenced Letitia, and in the end had led to her tragic death. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat by her fireplace, her knitting needles working silently in her hands as she gazed into the flames. The village of St. Mary Mead was peaceful once more, but in the quiet of her home, the memories of Marley Comb still lingered. The people there had been changed, as much as they wanted to deny it. They would go on living their lives, but there would always be a shift, a quiet awareness that secrets, no matter how well guarded, could never remain hidden for long. In the distance, she heard the soft toll of the church bell. It was a sound that Miss Marple had known for as long as she could remember. A sound that meant peace, a reminder that life, despite its complexity and darkness, continued. People would go on, their daily routines unaffected by the things they would rather forget. But Miss Marple knew, in her quiet way, that some of them would never be the same again. The truth had a way of following people, even when they tried to bury it. It wasn't always as loud or as direct as a confession in front of a crowd. Sometimes it was a quiet whisper, a reminder tucked away in the dark corners of the mind. And sometimes it was a final letter, one written in haste, meant to be discovered only after someone had taken too long to act. As Miss Marple prepared for her evening walk, her thoughts turned to the last few days in Marley Comb. She had given them everything they needed: answers, closure, justice. But there was one thing she had not yet done. She walked down the lane, her steps slow and deliberate, as though she were savouring the stillness of the world around her. The Kew village had always been a haven for her, a place where things moved at their own pace, where time didn't rush forward in such a hurry. She had lived her life here in peace, knowing that the world, despite its flaws and imperfections, could still hold something worth preserving. Miss Marple stopped for a moment, looking at the setting sun. The orange and pink hues stretched across the sky, and she felt the weight of the day lifting from her shoulders. The world had a way of healing itself, slowly but surely. As she returned to her cottage, Miss Marple felt a rare sense of peace. The mystery had been solved. The village was safe, and her role in it all, her quiet, observing presence, had been enough. In the end, Miss Marple knew that the truth was always there. It wasn't hidden, nor was it always easy to find, but it was there, waiting to be uncovered. And sometimes the best thing one could do was to wait, to observe, and to listen. That night, as Miss Marple sat in her favourite chair, her knitting resting in her lap, she realised something. She had always known the world would change. People would come and go. Secrets would be kept. And, inevitably, the truth would always emerge. But she also knew that peace was a quiet thing, something earned only after the truth had been faced. And as the world outside settled into night, Miss Marple closed her eyes and felt the quiet embrace of that peace. And she knew, as she had always known, that there was nothing more powerful than the truth. Chapter 16. The Legacy of Marley Comb. Mary Mead had been kind to Miss Marple for as long as she could remember. The village was not unlike her own quiet thoughts, familiar, undemanding, and ever-changing in the gentlest of ways. The trees bloomed and shed their leaves, the seasons passed in their usual rhythm, and the villagers went about their lives, some more loudly than others, but all with their own histories, their own quiet secrets. Miss Marple had never seen her village as a place to search for mysteries. Life here was simple, and in its simplicity it was perfect. But the truth was that even in the quietest corners, secrets found their way in, just as they had in Marley Comb. They hid in plain sight, tucked away in forgotten letters, hushed conversations and actions people thought no one would notice. It had been months since Miss Marple had returned from Marley Comb, and yet the village still lingered in her thoughts, more persistent than she had expected, not because of the murder or the way the case had unfolded, but because of the fear that had shaped everything, the fear that had kept Marley Comb in its grip for so long, fear of exposure, fear of being found out, fear of the truth itself. The truth Miss Marple had long known was never as simple as people believed. It didn't come neatly wrapped or fully understood. It crept in, unnoticed at first, and then slowly unravelled the threads of people's lives until they could no longer deny what had been hidden. She sat by her window, the autumn wind tugging at the last of the leaves on the trees outside. The dyed light of the setting sun reflected off the still water in the nearby pond, casting a soft glow that felt both peaceful and foreboding. Miss Marple had always known that truth, in its purest form, was both liberating and devastating. It cleared the air, yes, but it also left behind the wreckage of things once buried. But then again, she had seen this before. People made mistakes. They hid things from each other. But in the end, the truth always came out, whether they liked it or not. As she walked through the village the next morning, Miss Marple's eyes drifted over the familiar sights. The bakery, the market, the churchyard, where so many of the village's stories were buried. It was as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. The village, once wrapped in the quiet, deceptive shroud of secrecy, had shed a great burden. And though the people were still the same, their lives had been altered by the unveiling of their hidden truths. The vicar, now retired and no longer in the shadow of his own guilt, had moved to a small cottage in a neighbouring village. The church had reopened its doors, but the records of its finances, now corrected and accounted for, were no longer hidden from view. Even Mrs. Featherstone, who had once been so deeply afraid of the truth, had begun to speak more freely, though her eyes still carried the weight of what she had chosen not to confront. And then there was Peter Knoll, who had served his time and returned to Marley Comb, though he was a shadow of the man he had been before. The village was no longer a place where he could hide. His crime and his punishment had followed him like a scar that could never fully heal. But despite the changes, life in Marley Comb went on. The villagers had learned their lessons, perhaps not all of them willingly, but they had learned. And that, Miss Marple thought, was the true cost of secrecy. It weighed on the soul, but it also demanded a price. And some people would never truly recover from what had been uncovered. A few weeks later, Emily Hargrave came to visit Miss Marple at her cottage, a small bundle of letters in hand. "I thought you might want to see these," Emily said, sitting down beside her. "I found them among some old papers. They're from the Norrington family. the ones that were left behind after they left the village. I didn't know what to do with them, but I thought you might find something of interest." Miss Marple took the bundle with a steady hand. Her curiosity piqued. She untied the string that held the letters together and began to flip through them. Most were faded, yellowed with age, but the names and dates were still legible. "These, Miss Marple," said softly, "are the missing pieces. I had wondered where they had gone." Emily looked at her quizzically. "What do you mean?" "These letters belong to Edmund Norrington," Miss Marple said, her voice steady but filled with quiet realization. "He was the one pulling the strings in Marley Comb long before the Blackwood case ever came to light. These letters, they tell the story of the family's rise and fall, their involvement in the finances, and the way they kept their grip on the village for so long." Emily's brow furrowed. "So all of this, everything we uncovered, it was tied to them?" "Yes, Emily. The Norrington family may have left, but their influence remained. They were the ones who shaped much of what happened in Marley Comb, especially in the church. They didn't just leave behind records. They left behind a legacy of secrets and lies, and a town built on the foundation of fear." Emily sat in silence for a long moment. "And now that the truth's come out, what happens to Marley Comb?" Miss Marple thought about it for a moment, her eyes resting on the stillness outside her window. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the village, and everything felt just as it had when she first arrived. "Perhaps Marley Comb will never be the same," Miss Marple said. "But the truth is out now. The lies have been exposed, and though the village may never return to its peaceful, quiet state, it will have the chance to heal. People will remember what happened, but eventually they'll move forward." Miss Marple stood up and walked to the window, her gaze sweeping across the village. In the distance, the church stood tall, the same as it always had. Its windows were clear, its doors open. There was no more hiding. The truth, Miss Marple knew, had done its work. The village had been shaken to its core, but in the end it had been cleansed. No more secrets, no more lies. The village would move on, as it always had, but it would never forget. And as Miss Marple prepared to close the door on another case, she felt a rare sense of contentment. For her, this was enough. The world was full of secrets, yes. But Miss Marple knew better than anyone. The truth would always find a way out. Chapter 17. The Calm. After the storm, Miss Marple sat in her favourite armchair by the fire, her knitting needles still and unused. The flames flickered, casting a soft glow across the room, and the familiar scent of old books and lavender filled the air. It was a quiet evening, as most evenings in St. Mary Mead were, the kind of evening that Miss Marple had come to treasure in her later years. The village was at peace, and she, too, had found her peace. For the first time in months, the weight of Marley Comb, of the truths uncovered, the lives changed, seemed to lift. The quiet rhythm of life in St. Mary Mead was as it always had been. There was a comfort in that, a familiarity that made her feel, for a moment, that nothing could ever truly disturb the gentle order of the world. But there was something else, something that lingered in the back of her mind. The case in Marley Comb had been solved, the murderer brought to justice, but the ripple effects were far-reaching. It wasn't just about who had killed Letitia Blackwood. It was about what had been revealed. The village of Marley Comb had lived for so long with its secrets, its fears, and its unspoken rules. It had been a place of smiles and silences, of buried grudges and whispered gossip. But the moment those secrets were unearthed, the village had been forced to confront the truth. And though it would go on, as all villages do, there was no going back. Miss Marple had seen that before. She had seen it in countless cases, in countless lives. People lived in their quiet corners, hiding pieces of themselves, afraid of what would happen if the truth came to light. And when it did, when the truth was forced to the surface, it was always a painful process, but it was also a necessary one. As the evening drew to a close, Miss Marple put down her knitting and stood up, moving to the window. The sun had set, and the sky was painted with the last hues of orange and purple. The village, small and quiet, stretched out before her, its roofs nestled together beneath the rising moon. The next morning, Emily came to visit, her usual smile tinged with something else, something a little more thoughtful. "Good morning, Jane," she said as she entered, her voice warm but edged with the familiarity of something unspoken. "Good morning, Emily," Miss Marple replied, her tone calm and welcoming. "What brings you here this morning?" Emily hesitated for a moment before sitting down beside her cousin. "I've been thinking a lot about Marley Comb," she said softly, "about how much has changed." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. Change is a strange thing, isn't it? It sneaks up on you when you least expect it. But sometimes it's necessary. "I know," Emily said, her voice quiet. "But sometimes I wonder if the cost is too high." "The cost of truth?" Miss Marple asked, her gaze turning towards the window once more. "The cost of unveiling what's hidden? Yes, Emily, but what else is there to do? We cannot live in the shadow of our own fears forever. The truth, no matter how difficult, is always worth the cost." Emily shifted, her hands clasped together. "Do you think the villagers will ever be the same?" "They will," Miss Marple said, her voice steady. "But it will take time. People don't change overnight, and they don't always change in the way we expect. But the important thing is that they've learned. They've faced the truth, and though it may take years to truly heal, they have the chance to start anew." Emily smiled, a little more at ease now. "I think you're right, Jane. I think they'll find their way. It just feels strange, seeing it all laid out like that, seeing how fragile everything was." "Fragile, yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but not broken. People bend, but they rarely break. We are all capable of more than we think. We just need to face the truth of who we are even when it's difficult." As the days passed, Miss Marple's thoughts continued to linger on the village she had left behind. Marley Comb was changing, yes, but so was she. Every case, every mystery, every life she encountered added a new layer to her understanding of human nature. And though she had no intention of solving another murder, at least not any time soon, the lessons she had learned in Marley Comb would stay with her. The truth, Miss Marple knew, was both a weapon and a balm. It could destroy, but it could also heal, and in the quiet, gentle corners of the world, It was the only thing that truly mattered. One evening, as Miss Marple sat in her garden, a soft breeze rustling the leaves of the trees, she looked up at the stars above. The village below was still peaceful, and for the first time in a long while, she felt that familiar, comforting sense of home. The case was over, the secrets were out, and the village was beginning to find its peace. But Miss Marple knew that she would always be watching, always observing, always waiting for the next truth to reveal itself. And when it did, as it always did, she would be ready. Chapter 18. The Final Truth. The village of St. Mary Mead remained as it always had been. The familiar sounds of church bells, the sight of the children running through the lanes, and the chatter of the villagers at the market, all gave the impression that little had changed in this quiet corner of England. But Miss Marple knew better. Change was something that could not be seen at first glance. It was not always loud or dramatic. It was a subtle shift, like the slow change of the seasons, where you barely noticed the transformation until it was almost too late to remember how things had been before. For Miss Marple, the mystery of Marley Comb was now part of the past, but it had left its mark on her. The case had been solved, the truth had been revealed, and the village, though bruised, had begun the long process of healing. The whispers had stopped, the fear had dissipated, but the village had been irrevocably altered, and Miss Marple knew that it would never be the same. And yet that was the way of the world. The truth, as Miss Marple had always known, had a way of creeping to the surface. It had a way of revealing itself, whether you were ready for it or not. She had learned that people, despite their best efforts, could only hide their true selves for so long. Fear, shame, pride, these were the things that drove them to keep their secrets buried. But the cost of living in such a way was high. Eventually, the truth would always come knocking. It was just a matter of when. Miss Marple sat in her garden, her knitting resting on her lap. The sun had started to set, casting a warm golden light over the cottage and the garden beyond. The flowers were in full bloom, their colours vibrant against the backdrop of green. She had always found peace here, in the simple routine of her life. She'd never been one to seek out drama or excitement. Her days had always been filled with small, quiet joys. A walk through the village, a cup of tea with friends, a well-kept garden. But even in this peaceful corner of the world, secrets remained. They always would. People would continue to live with their regrets, their mistakes, their fears. Some would keep their heads low, hoping not to draw attention. Others, like Letitia Blackwood, would spend their lives gathering truths, unwilling to let the world around them stay in the dark. And Miss Marple, as she always had, would continue to observe. That evening, as she sat by the fire, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of reflection. The events of Marley Comb had unfolded over weeks, each day revealing new pieces of the puzzle. There had been the murder, the investigation, and the eventual discovery of the truth. But more than that, there had been the way the village itself had changed. She had seen how fear had shaped the lives of its inhabitants, how secrets had festered beneath the surface, and how, in the end, it had been the truth that had set them free, or at least given them a chance at redemption. It was a quiet realization, one that Miss Marple had come to understand over the years. Truth is never as simple as it seems. It is often messy, uncomfortable and painful. It forces people to face what they would rather forget. But it is also the only way forward, the only path to healing. Later that week, Emily came to visit, her expression thoughtful as she entered Miss Marple's cottage. "I've been thinking," Emily said, sitting down across from her cousin, "about everything that happened in Marley Comb. It's strange, isn't it? How much of the village's life was built on things that weren't." "True, yes," Miss Marple said, her voice soft. "But that is true of so many places, Emily. We all live with our own stories, our own versions of the truth. Some are more dangerous than others. But in the end, we all must come to terms with what is real." Emily nodded. "And Marley Comb will move on." "Of course," Miss Marple replied. "The village will heal. It may never be the same, but it will be stronger for having faced the truth." Emily's face softened, her gaze thoughtful. "I think you're right, Jane. There are some things we can't change, no matter how much we wish we could. But what we can do is make sure we learn from them, and Marley Comb will." As the days stretched into weeks, the village of St. Mary Mead remained the same. Life had returned to its regular rhythm. The seasons changed. The people came and went. But Miss Marple knew that beneath the quiet surface, things had been altered. The village might have been healed, but it had been touched by the events that had unfolded in Marley Comb, and those changes would last longer than the memories of the murder itself. She sat one morning in the churchyard, watching the children run past with their heads bent in concentration. They were not yet old enough to understand the weight of truth, but one day they would. One day they would carry the knowledge that nothing, not even the most carefully hidden secrets, could remain buried forever. For now, Miss Marple was content. The quiet peace of St. Mary Mead was enough for her. The village had its own stories, its own truths. She would not solve them all, but she would listen. And when the truth came calling, as it always did, she would be ready. That evening, as the sun began to set, Miss Marple sat in her favourite chair by the fire, a cup of tea in her hands. The warmth of the fire curled around her, and the familiar sounds of the village reached her ears. Life in St. Mary Mead was as it always had been, and yet she knew something had changed within herself. The truth had a way of revealing itself, no matter how much people tried to hide it, and Miss Marple had seen that truth in Marley Comb. She had brought it to light, and though it had been painful for some, it had also been freeing. There was nothing more powerful than the truth. It had the power to heal, to reveal, and to set people free. As the final light of day faded from the sky, Miss Marple smiled softly to herself. She had done what she came to do, and now the rest of the world could go on as it always had. She had helped Marley Comb face its truth, and for her that was enough. Chapter 19. The Last Case. The crisp autumn air rustled the leaves outside Miss Marple's cottage as she sat by the fire, the embers casting flickering shadows on the walls. The village of St. Mary Mead, still, as ever, continued its peaceful existence. The familiar sounds of the wind in the trees and the distant call of the church bell were constant reminders of the simple, unchanging world she had always known. But that world had not always been so simple. The case in Marley Comb had taught her more than she could have anticipated. She had solved the murder, yes, she had exposed the truth, and in doing so, she had unearthed the fear and secrecy that had bound the village for so many years. But now, the last of the loose ends had been tied up. The Norrington family's involvement in the financial scandal had been revealed, the church records corrected, and the murderer, Peter Knoll, had been arrested and tried. The villagers had all gone back to their routines, their lives resuming the familiar, unremarkable course they had followed before Letitia Blackwood's death. For Miss Marple, however, things would never be the same. She had learned more than she had ever expected about the people of Marley Comb, about their hidden fears and the lengths they would go to protect their secrets. But more than that, she had learned that the truth was never as clean as it appeared on the surface. It was messy, complicated, and always arrived in its own time, whether people were ready for it or not. That morning Emily had come by to visit, her usual cheery demeanour tinged with a quiet sadness. "Is it time, Jane?" Emily had asked, standing by the door, her hand resting on the doorknob. "Are you really going back to your cottage in St. Mary Mead for good?" Miss Marple had looked at her cousin, the soft smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Yes, Emily, it's time. There's no more to do here. Marley Comb is healing, as it always does. The village will move on, and I must do the same." Emily nodded, her eyes filled with unspoken understanding. "You've been so much more to the village than anyone could have imagined. We all owe you so much. I only did what anyone else would have done," Miss Marple had replied, "but the truth was buried for too long, and sometimes it takes someone with a little patience and a lot of quiet observation to find it." As they had shared one last cup of tea, Emily had smiled, though it was a bittersweet expression. "You know, Jane, there's one thing I'll always remember about your visit here." "And what's that?" Miss Marple had asked, intrigued. "That even in the darkest moments when everyone thought the secrets were buried for good, you were there, quietly watching, quietly waiting. You never rushed. You understood that the truth would always come in its own time." Miss Marple had smiled, feeling the quiet pride of knowing that her methods had, once again, brought clarity to the world. "And the truth, Emily, always finds a way. It may be hidden, but it always surfaces." That evening, as Miss Marple sat alone in the cosy quiet of her cottage, she reflected on the weeks she had spent in Marley Comb. She had come to the village with one purpose: to solve a murder. But she had left with something far deeper, a greater understanding of the people around her, of their fears, their desires, and their need to protect what they had. But even more than that, she had seen how the truth had a power of its own. It didn't need to be forced. It didn't need to be manipulated. It simply needed to be given space to be revealed. The village had learned a valuable lesson, she knew. Letitia Blackwood had done more than just expose the financial fraud. She had shown Marley Comb that the walls built to keep the truth out would always eventually crumble. No one could live forever in the shadow of their secrets. Miss Marple stood from her armchair and walked to the window, looking out at the moonlit garden. The peace of St. Mary Mead wrapped around her like an old familiar blanket. The village had returned to its rhythm, and in the distance she could see the familiar silhouettes of the church steeple and the houses nestled around it. The past months in Marley Comb had been filled with tension, revelations, and quiet moments of deep reflection. But it was time to leave it behind. The village would continue to grow, just as it always had. That night, Miss Marple had packed her things in her small suitcase. The clothes she had worn during her time in Marley Comb were folded neatly, and the few mementos she had collected, a few letters, a book of pressed flowers, were tucked away in the bottom. She had no real desire to hold on to the past. She had solved the case. She had brought the truth to light. And now it was time to let it go. Her life would return to its usual routine, simple, quiet, filled with moments of peace and solitude. The world was full of stories, mysteries, and secrets. But for now, Miss Marple could rest. The next morning, as Miss Marple stood on the platform of St. Mary Mead's small station, the train arriving from the city pulled into the station with its familiar hissing sound. She felt the weight of the decision settle into her chest. It was time. And as she boarded the train, her thoughts turned back to Marley Comb. The truth had come to light, and the village had begun to heal. But the legacy of what had been uncovered would linger in the hearts of those who had lived through it. The secrets that had once threatened to tear the village apart had been exposed, and now there was nothing left but the quiet aftermath. As the train pulled away from the station, Miss Marple leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes. There would be other cases, other mysteries to solve, but for now she could rest easy. The world was full of people carrying their secrets. But Miss Marple knew, in the end, the truth always found a way to rise to the surface. And she would always be there, quietly watching, waiting for the moment it was ready to be uncovered.